High upon the sheer cliffs of southwest China, wooden coffins still cling to the rock face, suspended between earth and sky. For centuries, travelers have looked up in awe and wonder. Who placed them there? Why rest the dead in midair, so far from the soil of the living? To follow the trail of these mysteries is to uncover the story of the Bo people, an ancient community that once thrived in Sichuan and Yunnan. Their culture stretched back 3 millennia, yet by the late Ming dynasty, they were driven into the mountains and ultimately vanished. All that remains of their vanished world are these coffins, mute witnesses carved into stone. From the first modern discoveries in the early 20th century, through the official excavations of the 1970s, archaeologists have found pottery, jade, instruments, layered clothing, and even vivid red murals on cave walls. These traces suggest a society rich in art, ritual, and hierarchy. Scientific dating shows the custom spans over 2,000 years, from the spring and autumn period, through the Song dynasty, and into the Ming. The coffins themselves come in many forms, boat-shaped, house-like, massive, and intricate, raising the question of how such heavy structures were placed high above with no modern tools. Legends speak of the Bo as children of the cliffs, sky conquerors who sought to lift their ancestors closer to the heavens. Scholars wonder if the height symbolized protection, nobility, or a sacred path beyond. Parallels appear across Asia, even in Vietnam, where similar cliff burials have been found among mountain peoples. Modern archaeology, despite daring scaffolds and dangerous climbs, has yet to solve the riddle completely, and so the central enigma endures. Why did they suspend the dead between earth and sky? The Bo are long gone, yet their coffins remain, dark silhouettes on pale stone, whispering of lives once lived, of beliefs that outlast empires, and of memory carved into the mountains themselves. This is the story of the hanging coffins of the Bo people, 16 chapters of mystery, history, and echoes of a lost world. High in the mountains of southwest China, where clouds drift like restless spirits and cliffs plunge toward shadowed rivers, there are coffins that do not rest in the ground. They hover, suspended halfway between earth and sky. From a distance, they look like wooden scars clinging stubbornly to vertical rock faces. Silent, defiant, impossible. They are known as the hanging coffins. The sight is startling even to seasoned travelers. Coffins lodged on narrow ledges, some balanced on wooden beams driven into sheer rock, others tucked into caves that open like mouths along the cliff walls. The wind whistles through these valleys, and with it comes the eerie impression that the dead themselves are watching, perched above, unreachable. For centuries, only birds could touch them, and yet they are human graves. The first question strikes immediately: who placed them there? The mountains are merciless, with walls of stone rising like barriers to the heavens. Even today, with ropes, scaffolds, and climbing gear, reaching some of these coffins would be a feat of danger. And yet, hundreds were raised and set upon their lofty perches. Some coffins weigh more than 200 kilograms. Massive, carved from single trunks of hardwood. Why would anyone choose such an unnatural place to bury their dead? Why not the earth, soft and familiar, or the caves within reach? Why suspend loved ones in the open air, exposed to storms and the burning sun? The answer lies in a people long vanished, whose memory has all but dissolved into myth. The Bo little is remembered of them today. Their villages have vanished, their language has disappeared, and their customs remain only as scattered fragments, mentioned in passing by dynastic records or recalled faintly in folklore. But one legacy remains impossible to ignore: the hanging coffins. They are the last testament of a people who once thrived here, guardians of a tradition that fused defiance, reverence, and mystery. The cliffs themselves seem complicit in the ritual. Towering over the rivers of Sichuan and Yunnan, they resemble natural cathedrals, places where human life could approach the sacred. The Bo chose these places not by accident but with intent. To the living, the cliffs were walls that separated their world from the heavens above. To the dead, suspended high, they may have been bridges to the afterlife. And yet, the mystery deepens. Hanging coffins are not unique to China. Similar practices have been found in parts of the Philippines, Indonesia, and even remote valleys of Vietnam. Across Asia, different peoples once raised their dead above the ground, sometimes to honor them, sometimes to protect them, always for reasons steeped in faith and fear. But nowhere is the custom so visually striking, so haunting, as in the mountains of southwest China. Standing before such a cliff, one cannot help but imagine the funeral procession centuries ago. Villagers carrying the heavy coffin through steep mountain paths, chanting in unison, stopping to rest beneath the weight. Then, at the cliff's edge, ropes unfurl, beams are hammered into cracks of stone. Men lower themselves on vines and timber scaffolds. With patience, strength, and perhaps prayer, the coffin is guided into its place. Finally, when the ropes are cut and the coffin rests, silence falls. The living descend. The dead remain in their sky-born tomb. Generations passed. Rain carved the cliffs. Moss crept into stone. Rivers surged and fell with the seasons. But the coffins endured. Some rotted and fell, breaking open at the foot of the cliffs, their contents spilling like secrets unburied. Others still cling stubbornly above, centuries later. The wood has blackened, iron nails rusted, yet they remain, as though the spirits they contain refuse to descend. These coffins are not just graves. They are messages from the past, carved into the landscape, declaring that a people once lived here with beliefs powerful enough to challenge stone, storm, and gravity itself. They tell us that death, to the Bo, was not an ending hidden underground but a passage that demanded elevation. The mystery has lured explorers, archaeologists, and storytellers alike. And though scholars have uncovered pieces of the puzzle, much remains untold. The coffins whisper of a culture that defied erasure, one that faced the heavens with audacity and reverence. This is where our story begins, among the cliffs of mystery, where the dead do not sleep beneath the earth but linger between worlds, suspended in the thin air of eternity. Long before dynasties rose and fell, long before the valleys of Sichuan and Yunnan echoed with the footsteps of modern travelers, the mountains belonged to a people now remembered only in fragments. The Bo were not an empire, nor were they recorded in sweeping chronicles like the Han or the Tang. Instead, they lived quietly along the rivers and mountains, cultivating the land, hunting in forests, and weaving rituals into every turn of life. Their presence dates back nearly 3,000 years, to a time when the world was still divided among countless small tribes, each with its own gods, its own customs, its own ways of binding life to death. What is known of them comes not from their own voices. They left no written script, but from the silence of their coffins and the faint traces in Chinese records. The Bo people honored their ancestors with a devotion that rivaled any great civilization. To them, the dead did not simply vanish. They lingered, watching, protecting, guiding the living. And so, the Bo raised their coffins high, lifting their loved ones above the earth, as if giving them a vantage point over valleys, rivers, and skies. Their villages would have been small clusters of wooden homes, nestled against terraced hillsides. Children grew up learning to climb steep paths. Women wove cloth dyed with plant colors, Men hunted and carved coffins from giant hardwoods. Life was simple yet profoundly spiritual, for every season carried ritual meaning, and every death was a moment to reconnect the living with the unseen. But time has a way of swallowing the quiet. By the late Ming Dynasty, nearly 600 years ago, the fate of the bow shifted. The Ming court sought to consolidate control over the borderlands, and those who resisted often faced destruction. In this wave of campaigns, the bow were struck hard. Some were absorbed into neighboring peoples, their language and customs slowly erased. Others were scattered, their descendants blending into the Han, Yi, or Miao, and some, perhaps, simply disappeared, swallowed by the silence of history. Even as politics pressed upon them, nature changed the balance of survival. From the Americas came maize and potatoes, hardy crops that could grow on steep mountain soil where rice once failed. For the Han settlers moving southwest, these new foods meant opportunity. Hillsides once too barren for traditional crops now burst with maize stalks and potato fields. Slowly, migration spread. Han farmers climbed into the bow heartlands, bringing plows, villages, and their own traditions. The land that once belonged to the bow was transformed, and with it, the old ways faded. The bow, who once hung their coffins with reverence, dwindled under the combined weight of conquest and assimilation. Their names dissolved from records. Their language fell silent. Only the coffins, suspended high upon the cliffs, refused to vanish. To stand before these relics is to stand before the last breath of a people. The coffins do not merely mark graves. They are echoes of a vanished nation, stubbornly holding on to the mountains. They tell us that the bow lived, that they honored, that they dreamed of eternity. And though their voices are gone, the cliffs still remember. By the time the Ming Dynasty stretched its banners across China, the bow were already a people of the margins. They lived in their mountain valleys, guarded by cliffs and rivers, holding on to rituals that seemed ancient even then. For generations, they had endured quietly, neither seeking conquest nor inviting it. But empires seldom tolerate what they cannot control. The Ming emperors, determined to consolidate the frontiers, looked toward the rugged lands of Sichuan and Yunnan. To them, the bow were outsiders different in tongue, custom, and loyalty, and so campaigns were sent. Soldiers marched through valleys where the bow had farmed for centuries, their armor clattering against the silence of forests. The bow resisted. They retreated deeper into the mountains, using cliffs and ravines as their fortresses. They knew the land as only those born of it could. Every hidden path, every rushing stream, every cave that might shelter them. For a time, their defiance seemed unbreakable. Ming armies pressed forward, but the bow slipped back into the ridges, surviving as shadows among stone. Yet empires have patience, and the Ming could not be turned aside. Year after year they returned, tightening their grip. By 1573, the resistance of the bow was shattered. Villages were burned, families scattered, and the last embers of a culture were stamped out. Some survivors were absorbed into neighboring peoples. Others simply vanished into silence, their names and songs never written, never remembered. It was not just a defeat, it was an erasure. Where once a people had lived with their own gods, their own language, their own rhythm of life, there now remained only absence. The mountains grew quiet, save for the rush of rivers and the cry of birds, and yet the bow left something behind, something even the Ming could not destroy. High on the cliffs, untouched by flames and soldiers, the coffins remained, hundreds of them, clinging to stone like stubborn memories. They became the final testament of a people who refused to vanish completely. Though their voices were silenced, their dead still looked down upon the valleys, guardians of secrets the conquerors could never take. There is tension in this silence. A civilization was wiped from the earth, but its presence lingers in wood and stone. To gaze upon the hanging coffins today is to feel that collision between empire and tribe, power and fragility, life and death. The bow may have fallen, but the cliffs still carry their story, written not in ink, but in shadows above the river. For centuries after the bow were gone, their cliffs stood in silence. Villagers passed beneath them, sometimes glancing up at the dark shapes on the rock walls, sometimes whispering old tales to children. Stories of spirits watching from above, of ancestors who refused the earth. The coffins lingered, but their makers were forgotten. It was only when travelers and scholars began to wander deeper into Sichuan and Yunnan that curiosity sharpened into study. The first accounts were not the polished notes of historians, but the startled words of locals who guided strangers through the valleys. To outsiders, the coffins seemed impossible. How had anyone managed to place them so high, where even mountain goats would hesitate to climb? In the late Ming and Qing dynasties, scattered records began to mention them. Officials noted their presence, puzzling over their origins. Some wrote that the coffins were proof of an ancient people now lost to time. Others suspected they were relics of wandering spirits or hidden tribes. None could explain how such heavy wooden caskets had been lifted into place. By the 19th century, Western explorers, too, began to hear whispers of these strange graves in the cliffs. Missionaries traveling through Yunnan recorded them with awe, describing entire faces of rock studded with coffins like the nests of giant birds. To them, it was a riddle that spoke of a forgotten civilization, one that had defied both gravity and time. When modern archaeologists first examined the coffins closely, they were astonished. The wood was cut from giant hardwood trees, each coffin carved from a single trunk, smoothed and sealed. Some rested on beams driven into cracks of stone. Others lay within shallow caves, their edges carefully aligned. A few had fallen to the valley floors below, smashing open to reveal bones, pottery shards, and remnants of ancient lives. It was in these broken coffins that the first real discoveries were made. Scholars found skeletons, men, women, children, laid with care. Traces of pigment suggested rituals once marked the wood. Pottery and tools hinted at daily life long vanished. Bit by bit, the outline of a lost people emerged. And yet, mystery endured. Why had the coffins been placed so high? Were the bow seeking to keep their dead safe from animals, floods, or enemies? Or did the cliffs carry spiritual meaning? A ladder between the living world and the heavens. Each theory added to the fascination, but none could erase the silence left by the vanished tribe. The first discoveries were not just about coffins. They were about the persistence of memory. A people erased by war and time had left a final message, one that could not be buried or forgotten. And as each coffin was studied, a faint voice returned from the past, reminding the living that the bow had once walked the valleys, carved the wood, and lifted their dead toward the sky. By the mid-20th century, the hanging coffins were no longer just whispers in local lore or curiosities noted by wandering travelers. They had become a question that modern archaeology could no longer ignore. China was changing rapidly, and with that change came a new drive to explore the roots of its history. In the 1970s, teams of Chinese archaeologists set their sights on the enigmatic cliffs of Sichuan and Yunnan. The world was watching, for few had ever studied the coffins directly. For centuries, they had been too dangerous to reach, left to weather and decay. But now, with ropes, scaffolding, and determination, scholars began their ascent. The climbs were perilous. Researchers dangled from sheer walls, their bodies swaying above rivers, the weight of equipment dragging against stone. Some coffins lay 30 meters high, others even farther, where a single slip could mean death. Yet the pull of discovery was stronger than fear. Piece by piece, they reached the coffins, pried open lids long sealed, and carefully removed the contents for study. What they found astonished them. The coffins, many carved from massive logs of Nanmu wood, had survived for centuries, some for nearly 2,000 years. Inside lay human remains, skeletons wrapped in silence, their bones brittle but intact. Alongside them, archaeologists uncovered bronze daggers, wooden bowls, ceramic vessels, and even fragments of clothing. These were not crude burials, but carefully arranged rituals, suggesting a people who honored their dead with ceremony and skill. The excavations revealed details about craftsmanship too. The coffins were not simple boxes. They were hollowed from single trunks, their lids fitted with precision. Some bore traces of red pigment, symbols of vitality and protection in many ancient cultures. Others carried decorative carvings, faint but deliberate, as if each coffin told its own story. For the first time, the bow were no longer shadows in records. They had faces, shapes, and tools. Their daily lives began to emerge. They were hunters, farmers, craftsmen. They forged metal, wove cloth, and believed deeply in the bond between life and death. Though they had left no written words, their coffins spoke volumes. And yet, mystery remained. The greatest question, how they had raised these massive coffins into the cliffs, was still unanswered. The 1970s excavations provided fragments of knowledge, but no complete solution. Did they use scaffolds of bamboo and wood now long rotted away? Did they rely on ropes and pulleys, or lower coffins from above instead of climbing from below? Each theory had merit, but none could be proven. The work of the 1970s did more than uncover bones and artifacts. It rekindled the world's fascination with the bow suddenly. They were no longer forgotten entirely. Their story returned to life in museums and reports, their coffins described in journals, their memory preserved not just in cliffs but in human understanding. The mountains had held their secret for centuries. Now, at last, they had begun to speak. Though the bow left behind no written words, they left traces, subtle, fragile, and easily overlooked. Archaeologists who studied the hanging coffins did not find only bones and wood. They also uncovered fragments of cloth, faint patterns of dye, and even images on walls that seemed to whisper the outlines of their vanished world. Among the most delicate discoveries were pieces of textile, pulled carefully from within coffins that had been sealed for centuries. Time had frayed them, moisture had eaten away at their fibers, yet the colors endured faintly. Some were dyed in deep reds, others in earth tones drawn from plants and minerals. Their weave was simple but deliberate, the kind of fabric that spoke of skill passed down through generations. To touch these remnants was to feel the echo of hands that had once spun thread, perhaps mothers or daughters who wove in the quiet hours while mountains darkened outside. Cloth has always been more than clothing. For the bow, it may have carried ritual significance. Some fragments seemed to be wrappings for the dead, others coverings for objects placed in coffins. The patterns, where they could still be discerned, hinted at symbols, perhaps marks of clan or spirit, woven not for decoration alone but as prayers preserved in fiber. Murals, too, have surfaced in caves once linked to bow settlements. Though weathered and faint, They reveal scenes of daily life and ritual. Figures with outstretched arms, stylized animals, patterns that spiral like rivers or rise like flames. Some images suggest processions, lines of figures carrying burdens, perhaps coffins, perhaps offerings. Others hint at a cosmology now lost, where earth and sky were bridged by human devotion. To a trained eye, these fragments of image and textile are not mere remnants. They are voices. They suggest that the bow were not only craftsmen of wood and stone, but also weavers of meaning, storytellers through thread and pigment. Their art was not grand like the scrolls of the Chinese courts, but intimate, designed to accompany the dead, to protect the living, and to bind a people together. Each thread, each faded mural, is a trace of memory. They remind us that even when a people vanishes, their spirit lingers in the smallest things. The weave of a cloth, the curve of a painted line, the stubborn persistence of color against centuries of darkness. Through textiles and murals, the bow whisper across time. Their coffins may dominate the cliffs, but these fragile traces reveal the humanity behind the mystery. The mothers who wove, the painters who drew, the families who honored their dead with beauty as well as wood. If the hanging coffins are the last voices of the bow, then time itself is their echo. To understand them fully, scholars have had to ask a question both simple and vast. When did this tradition begin, and when did it end? The cliffs hold coffins from many centuries, but they do not speak their ages easily. The wood is weathered, the paint faint, the artifacts scattered. Yet with patient study, radiocarbon testing, analysis of tool marks, comparison of artifacts, archaeologists have begun to map the life of the custom. Most of the coffins in Sichuan and Yunnan date from around 2,500 to 1,500 years ago, flourishing during the late spring and autumn period and into the Ming Dynasty. Some scholars believe the earliest coffins may be older still, touching the threshold of 3,000 years. Others argue the practice continued as late as the 14th and 15th centuries, when the bow were finally absorbed or destroyed under Ming rule. The wide span suggests a tradition deeply rooted, passed carefully from generation to generation. For perhaps 2 millennia, children grew up watching their elders carry coffins to the cliffs, listening to chants as ropes strained and beams creaked, learning that to honor the dead meant to raise them toward the sky. The persistence of this custom speaks not of habit, but of belief so strong it endured despite floods, wars, and the coming of empires, and yet, dating reveals more than endurance. The coffins themselves change over time. Early ones are cruder, heavy blocks carved roughly, wedged into natural caves. Later coffins are more refined, smoothed wood, painted surfaces, carefully placed beams. These shifts hint at a people who not only preserved tradition but adapted, perfecting their methods even as pressure from outside grew. By the late Ming period, however, the chain was broken. The campaigns that crushed the bow silenced not only their villages but their funerals. After the 16th century, the cliffs fell quiet. No new coffins were raised. The tradition ended abruptly, like a flame snuffed out, leaving only the remnants to darken with a Jetio date. The coffins is to see the life of a culture in miniature. Its rise, its flowering, its sudden collapse. Each wooden box is both a tomb and a timeline, a fragment of history carved into the very face of the mountains. And when the last date passes, when the coffins stop appearing, the silence of the cliffs tells us what written records do not. That a people is gone, but not forgotten. Not all hanging coffins are alike. To stand beneath the cliffs is to notice their quiet diversity. Shapes, sizes, colors, and placements that shift from valley to valley, century to century. Each coffin carries not only a body but a meaning, a message carved into wood for those who came after. Some coffins are massive, hewn from giant trunks of nanmu or camphor, their lids carved into rounded arcs that resemble the hull of a boat. Others are smaller, plainer, little more than rectangular boxes of wood. The boat-shaped design appears again and again, leading scholars to wonder if it symbolized a vessel for the soul, a journey across the waters of death, carrying the spirit to the other shore. In this reading, every coffin is both tomb and ship, a passage through unseen rivers. Traces of pigment suggest that many coffins were once painted. Reds, blacks, and earth tones clung stubbornly to their surfaces, colors that spoke of vitality, protection, and the cycles of life. Some coffins bore carvings, swirling lines, simple figures, perhaps totemic animals. Though faint now, they hint at beliefs woven into every burial, where wood was not only a container but a canvas of prayer. Placement, too, was symbolic. Some coffins rest high, balanced on beams driven deep into vertical cliffs. Others nestle within shallow caves, peering outward like watchful eyes. A few were placed near river bends, where water surged and curved, as if the dead might ride its eternal flow. The higher the coffin, some suggest, the greater the honor, a sign of the family's devotion or the individual's importance. To lift the dead closer to the heavens was to grant them nearness to the divine. Variety also spoke of practicality and change. Over centuries, styles shifted. Early coffins were rougher, later ones more refined. Some regions favored smaller coffins, perhaps reflecting scarcity of wood or differing ritual practices. This diversity reminds us that the Bo were not a frozen people but a living culture, adapting, reshaping, and interpreting tradition in many ways. Yet across all the variations, one truth unites them. The coffins were never simply graves. They were symbols of journey, of protection, of reverence. They embodied a worldview in which death was not an end hidden in the soil but a transition lifted toward sky and stone. When we look upon them today, we do not see uniformity. We see individuality, each coffin whispering a slightly different story. Together, they form a chorus, a tapestry of belief woven through wood, color, and height. And in that variety, the Bo remind us that even in death, there is meaning, beauty, and a longing for eternity. The sight of a heavy coffin wedged into a cliff face, suspended more than 100 meters above the ground, stirs the same question in every visitor. How did they do it? Theories abound, each one reflecting both awe and frustration. Some scholars in the Ming era speculated that the river valleys once ran much higher, their waters brushing against the mouths of caves. Perhaps, they suggested, the Bo simply paddled their coffins to the cliffs, sliding them into hollows as if docking a boat. At first glance, it seemed plausible. Yet geology offers little support. These mountains have stood unchanged for millennia, their rivers carving steady paths with no sign of such vast rises in water. Others point to scaffolding. Archaeologists of the 1970s themselves resorted to bamboo frameworks and ropes, erecting fragile stairways against sheer stone. Could the Bo have done the same? Perhaps. But to imagine entire communities building scaffolds dozens of meters high, just to place a coffin swiftly before the body decayed, is to imagine a monumental effort repeated for every burial. Even with bamboo and timber in abundance, the time required seems daunting. There is another clue, etched into the cliffs themselves. Narrow holes, drilled in neat vertical lines, march up the rock face like a forgotten ladder. Some still contain rotting wooden pegs. These are not supports for coffins but for the living. footholds for the climbers who risked everything to carry the dead. By wedging planks between these posts, the bow may have built temporary walkways, delicate bridges suspended in the void. Once the coffin was in place, the path was removed, leaving no way back, no way for grave robbers to follow. Ropes, too, must have been part of the ritual. Woven from hemp or twisted vines, they could lower coffins into position from above, guided carefully by men who dangled like shadows against the cliff. Imagine the silence of such a ceremony. The creak of rope, the sharp scent of resinous wood, the whispered prayers as the dead slid into place between sky and earth, and no single method explains every coffin. In some sites, caves open easily to climbers. In others, sheer walls suggest lowering from the summit. Perhaps the bow adapted, choosing whichever method suited the mountain. That very adaptability may have been their genius, a willingness to meet the cliff on its own terms. And yet, behind every theory lies a greater truth. It was not only engineering that raised those coffins into the sky. It was belief. It was reverence strong enough to overcome danger, grief powerful enough to justify impossible labor. To suspend the dead above the world was to declare that death itself could be conquered by devotion in the end. Whether by scaffolding, rope, or secret paths known only to them, the bow carried their ancestors upward. And each coffin left behind is both a feat of engineering and an act of love, etched forever into the cliffs. Where history falters, legend steps in. For the people who lived in the shadow of these cliffs, the hanging coffins were never just wood and bone. They were proof of a time when humans and mountains spoke the same language, when spirits walked the valleys, and when the bow were more than ordinary mortals in Sichuan. One tale calls the bow the children of the cliffs. It is said they could climb like eagles, their hands and feet gripping stone with uncanny strength. Others whisper that they could fly, that their ancestors made a pact with the sky, and wings of spirit carried them up to place their dead where only the clouds could touch. To the living, each coffin seemed less a tomb and more a star fallen into the mountainside. One story tells of a jealous stranger who challenged the bow to master both water and sky. In answer, the bow buried their dead beneath lakes, then lifted them high upon cliffs, proving dominion over both realms. From above, the ancestors would watch as guardians, moon, star, and mountain spirit combined. Another tale, recorded centuries later among families in Yunnan who claim descent from the bow, speaks of the mighty He clan. They believed that by raising coffins into the wind, they would invite prosperity and strength to flow down upon their descendants. But when storms tore some coffins loose, crashing them into rivers below, fortune too was said to plummet. The clan's power dwindled, leaving behind only memories of greatness. Still, not all stories speak of glory. Some are warnings. Villagers tell of those who dared to disturb the coffins, prying open lids for relics. Misfortune followed swiftly. Crops failed, children sickened, storms swept across valleys. In these tales, the dead punished greed with unyielding force, guarding their aerial tombs with invisible wrath. What unites these legends is not factual certainty but an emotional truth. The bow inspired awe. To outsiders, their rites defied reason, and so imagination filled the void. Flight, fortune, curses. Each story gave voice to what people felt when they looked upward. A mixture of fear, wonder, and longing. Even today, when locals pass beneath the cliffs, some still bow their heads or whisper a prayer. For them, the coffins are not relics of strangers but silent neighbors, ancestors of the land itself. The myths endure because the coffins endure, suspended between history and dream, forever beyond reach, yet never beyond memory. What did it mean to raise the dead into the sky? To risk life and limb on vertical cliffs? To carry heavy coffins into places no thief could reach? The answer lies not only in practical logic, but in the beliefs that shaped the Bow's view of life and death. One interpretation is protection. By placing coffins high above, the Bow safeguarded them from scavengers, floods, and even human desecration. In an age when wars and migrations swept through valleys, safety for the dead was no small concern. Yet this practical answer does not explain the sheer audacity of height, the deliberate choice to place the ancestors where only the wind could touch them. A deeper meaning comes from their spiritual philosophy. The Bow seem to have seen the cliff not as an obstacle but as a bridge. To them, death was not a fall into darkness but an ascent toward the realm of spirits, stars, and gods. A coffin raised high was a soul raised higher, closer to the heavens. The living might dwell in valleys and fields, but the dead belonged to the sky. This belief can be glimpsed in what archaeologists found within the coffins. Everyday tools, clothing, even food were placed with the bodies, suggesting a conviction that the journey beyond required the same comforts as life below. Death was continuity, not rupture. A passage into another world, one that mirrored the living one. Others see in the hanging coffins a symbol of prestige. The higher the coffin, the greater the honor for the departed. To suspend one's dead in such perilous beauty was to proclaim strength, wealth, and devotion. In this reading, the cliffs became monuments, each coffin a testament to the community's resolve and reverence. And yet, another layer of meaning may lie in fear. To many ancient cultures, mountains were liminal spaces, haunted, dangerous, sacred. By placing their dead there, the Bow may have sought to contain the restless spirits, binding them in stone so they could not wander the homes of the living. High in their niches, the ancestors watched but did not intrude. In truth, the custom likely wove all these threads together: protection, honor, fear, and transcendence. What remains undeniable is the devotion behind it. Every coffin required the labor of many, the courage of climbers, the blessing of priests. Each was an act of communal faith, an assertion that even in death, the Bow people belonged not to oblivion, but to the eternal embrace of mountain and sky. The mystery of the hanging coffins does not end at the borders of Sichuan and Yunnan. Across the mountains and rivers to the south, in today's northern Vietnam, archaeologists have uncovered echoes of the same tradition. The discovery surprised many, yet it revealed that the Bow were not alone in seeking the cliffs as eternal guardians of the dead. In the rugged province of Tuen Quang, coffins have been found tucked into limestone cliffs above valleys, their positions strikingly similar to those in China. In some cases, entire caves were lined with coffins carved from thick timber, placed so high they seemed suspended in midair. Local legends, like those in Sichuan, speak of spirits who demanded the dead be kept close to the heavens, where mountain winds could carry prayers upward. The parallels extend further south. In parts of Quang Ben and along the Annamite Range, oral traditions remember ancestors who slept in the stone mountains, their resting places known but rarely touched. Though many of these coffins have long since decayed in the humid climate, traces, wooden fragments, cave niches, oral tales hint at a shared spiritual logic that spanned cultures. Scholars debate whether these practices emerged independently or spread along ancient trade and migration routes. The mountains of southern China and northern Vietnam were once home to a mosaic of non-Han peoples, speakers of Tibeto-Burman and Austroasiatic languages, linked by rivers and valleys more than by political boundaries. Ideas of how to treat the dead may have traveled as easily as salt, bronze, or rice. Vietnamese researchers note that the high placement of coffins was also a form of protection. In flood-prone valleys, to bury the dead in the earth was to risk their bodies washing away each rainy season. Cliffs offered permanence, just as they did for the bow. At the same time, spiritual meanings overlapped. Mountains were sacred, liminal spaces, where human and divine worlds touched. Though separated by borders and centuries, the people of these regions were bound by a common imagination. They saw death not as a descent into the soil, but as an elevation, an act of lifting the ancestors into the sky. In Vietnam, as in Sichuan, the cliffs became not barriers but bridges, shaping landscapes into sacred memorials. To the bow, height was more than geography. It was meaning. Every coffin suspended in the cliffs was a message carved into stone. The higher the resting place, the greater the honored. In many cultures, mountains have been seats of gods. Peaks pierce the sky, touching the sun and stars, while valleys lie in shadow. For the bow, the cliffs offered a vertical hierarchy of life and death. To raise the dead above the ground was to raise them above ordinary existence. Ancestors placed aloft were not merely remembered. They were exalted, guardians watching from a vantage point beyond mortal reach. Height also spoke of permanence. Earthly graves could be plundered or swept away, but a coffin lodged in the cliff, out of reach of beasts and floods, seemed eternal. It defied gravity and decay, as if proclaiming that the soul within, too, had transcended the fragile world below. Symbolism intertwined with status. Some coffins rest only a few meters above the ground, accessible with modest effort. Others hang dizzyingly high, demanding monumental labor. To raise a coffin so far was to display not only devotion but wealth and power. Communities that could marshal such effort announced themselves as strong, united, and faithful to their dead. And yet, height was not only about pride. It was about liminality. The cliffside is neither heaven nor earth, but a borderland. By placing the dead there, the bow symbolically positioned them between two worlds, still close enough to hear the voices of the living, yet far enough to dwell among the spirits. The coffins became bridges, suspended in the twilight space where life fades into eternity. Even centuries later, this symbolism has not lost its force. Travelers and scholars who crane their necks upward still feel it. That sense of awe of something beyond human scale. In the silence of a gorge, a single coffin clinging to the cliff face can seem like a declaration. A reminder that for the bow, death was not an end, but an elevation. Modern archaeology has brought the hanging coffins into sharper focus, yet also revealed the fragility of what remains. From the first systematic studies in the 1970s to more recent surveys, archaeologists have pieced together fragments of the Bow people's vanished world. But every discovery has come with a price, and with questions about how best to preserve these silent monuments. The challenges begin with the cliffs themselves. Many coffins remain in places too dangerous to reach. They're eroding under centuries of wind and rain. Archaeologists climb with ropes, scaffolds, or modern harnesses, yet each ascent risks damaging what they hope to protect. Some coffins have already collapsed, tumbling into rivers far below, their secrets shattered with the fall. Looting adds another layer of loss. For centuries, villagers and treasure seekers pried open coffins in search of valuables, bronze, jade, or even rare woods. By the time professional excavations began, many burial goods were gone, leaving only traces behind. What survived: woven textiles, painted murals, fragments of tools. now sit in museums, carefully preserved, but detached from the sacred landscapes that once gave them meaning. Climate, too, is relentless. In humid valleys, wood rots, pigments fade, and insects bore silently into ancient planks. Archaeologists race against time, balancing the need to study with the duty to conserve. Each coffin is both a text waiting to be read and a fragile body that crumbles under too much handling. There is also an ethical dimension. For local communities, the coffins are not only artifacts but ancestral presences. Excavation can feel like intrusion, disturbing spirits who were meant to rest undisturbed in the cliffs. Modern scholars must therefore tread carefully, seeking knowledge but with respect, often working alongside villagers to ensure that research does not sever cultural ties. And yet, despite all difficulties, progress continues. Radiocarbon dating refines timelines, drones now map entire cliff faces, and conservationists develop new methods to stabilize what exposed to the elements. The work is painstaking, but each step brings the Bow people closer to memory, pulling them back from the abyss of total forgetting. The greatest challenge, perhaps, is this: how to balance curiosity with reverence. Archaeology seeks answers, but the hanging coffins were never meant to be solved like a puzzle. They were acts of devotion, meant to endure beyond human reach. To study them is to walk a narrow ledge between preservation and intrusion, between history and sacred silence. For all the excavations, theories, and legends, the hanging coffins still guard their deepest secrets. Each new study seems to answer one mystery while opening another, leaving the story of the Bow poised forever between knowledge and enigma. The greatest question remains: why the cliffs? Was it protection, prestige, or a belief in ascent to the heavens? Archaeologists can measure wood grains and date pigments, but meaning slips through their fingers like river mist. No text left by the Bow has survived to speak their intent. What endures is interpretation, layer upon layer, like the cliffs themselves. Equally uncertain is the method. Wooden pegs, rope marks, and carved niches hint at scaffolds or pulleys, but no single theory explains every site. Did the Bow possess techniques lost to time, skills in climbing, engineering, or ritual that modern scholars can only guess at? Each coffin clinging to impossible stone seems to whisper that the Bow knew something we no longer do. There is also the question of continuity. If parallel traditions appeared in Vietnam, the Philippines, and even among Austronesian seafarers, were these customs linked by migration and exchange, or were they born independently from similar landscapes and fears? The wider web of connections remains tantalizingly out of reach. And then there is silence, the silence of the Bow themselves. Aside from their coffins, they left little behind. No chronicles, no carved stelae, no temples that we know of. Were they erased so completely by conquest that only their dead survived? Or did fragments of their culture quietly merge into the identities of other ethnic groups, hiding in plain sight among the living? Perhaps the greatest unsolved question is not about the past, but about us. Why do the hanging coffins continue to fascinate? Why do we crane our necks toward them, our hearts beating faster as if the dead still call to us? Maybe it is because they defy the ordinary. They remind us that humans are capable of daring acts for love, for faith, for memory. Acts that outlast the people who made them. In the end, the cliffs keep their counsel. The coffins remain where they were placed centuries ago, unreachable, untouchable, suspended between history and legend. They do not answer, they only endure, and in their endurance the questions echo louder still. Though the Bow themselves are gone, the cliffs still remember them. Each wooden coffin, weathered and cracked, is more than an artifact. It is a voice, faint yet steady, whispering of a people who once lived between river and sky in Sichuan and Yunnan. Villagers still look up at the coffins with a mixture of reverence and unease. To them, the Bo are not strangers but the old mountain people, whose spirits linger in the valleys. The names may be forgotten, the language silenced, but the presence endures. A bird's shadow gliding across the gorge, the rustle of wind in bamboo, the sudden chill when clouds cover the sun. All are felt as signs that the mountain people are near. Among some minority groups who trace their ancestry to the Bo, memory lives in subtler ways. Ritual songs, the weaving of certain patterns into cloth, the practice of honoring the dead with offerings placed high. These may be fragments of a larger whole, surviving unnoticed in daily life. Culture often hides in gestures long after names have faded. In this way, the Bo did not vanish completely. They transformed into memory, absorbed into the land itself. Their coffins remain like seeds rooted in stone, silent, immovable, yet alive in the imagination of all who see them. For archaeologists, they are a puzzle. For locals, they are guardians. For travelers, they are wonders. But above all, they are reminders that even small peoples erased from history's pages can leave marks so enduring that no empire can wipe them away. The cliffs keep their vigil, the coffins their silence, and the mountain people, though gone, are never entirely lost. As long as the wind sweeps through the gorges and the rivers carve the valleys, their memory will hang in the air, weightless, eternal, part of the living soul of the mountains. The hanging coffins remain, poised between earth and sky, their wooden shells darkened by centuries of wind and rain. They are not just relics of the Bo people, nor simply puzzles for archaeologists to solve. They are reminders of something far larger, the human desire to honor the dead, to place memory where it cannot be erased. The Bo may be gone, their names unspoken, their language silent, yet they endure in the cliffs they claimed as sacred. Each coffin is a testament to courage and devotion. The courage to risk life for ritual, the devotion to carry love into eternity. To lift their dead toward the heavens was to declare that life's bonds do not break at death, that memory itself has wings. And perhaps this is why the coffins still hold us in awe. They stand as proof that human beings, across time and place, have always sought ways to transcend the ordinary. Whether through temples, pyramids, or coffins clinging to stone, we leave behind signs that we were here, that we loved, that we remembered. The cliffs of Sichuan and Yunnan, and their echoes in Vietnam and beyond, are more than landscapes. They are libraries of silence, holding stories we may never fully read. Yet in that silence lies their power. Mystery, after all, is a kind of memory, the world's way of keeping alive what would otherwise be forgotten, so the coffins hang on. Fragile yet enduring, guardians of both history and imagination. And as long as people stand in the valleys and look upward in wonder, the mountain people live on in legend, in questions, in the timeless heartbeat of the cliffs themselves.